So let's start with WACC, weighted average cost of capital. The word weighted average cost of capital comes from the word cost of capital. Now what is cost of capital? So to keep things simple, there are two providers of finance. If I just consider in terms of basic financing. So there are two finance providers. Generally, we all know one is equity and second is through debt. So if we say that debt providers do require the interest against the investment or the loan that they are doing, that is correct. So we need to give them a return, let's suppose return of 10%, and same we need to give return to the equity provider, and let's suppose the return is 12%. So the interest that we need to give to the debt holder is the cost that company needs to bear if it is taking debt. So this is the cost of debt. And the return that the company needs to pay against equity is the return for the shareholder, and it is the cost for the company. So once we average these, so the average is known as weighted average cost of capital. We all know this is the minimum rate of return which is required by the providers of funds, and the company needs to make sure that company needs to cover this minimum cost of capital. So if you are making investment in any project, you need to ensure that the project should cover this minimum cost of capital that company needs to pay to the finance providers. So it is a cost for the company because company is taking the funds, and against those funds company needs to pay such a cost. This is known as weighted average cost of capital. Now in WACC we need to cover four things. This was a basic example that I gave you right now, and the same thing we discussed earlier as well. But now as we are at WACC, so we need to go into more detailed things. So when it comes to the calculation of weighted average cost of capital, so there are four things that we will consider. First, cost of equity. Second, cost of preferences. Third, cost of debt. Fourth, the calculation of weighted average cost of capital. So there are four things that we need to cover: cost of equity, cost of preferences, cost of debt, and after that we will work out WACC. So let's start our discussion one by one, starting from cost of equity. Okay, starting from cost of equity. What is cost of equity? Cost of equity is the return that equity holder wants. So the return of equity holder is basically considered as cost to the company. So the return of equity holder is actually cost to the company. If company gives a 10% return to the shareholder, so that 10% is the cost for the company and will be considered as return for the shareholder. Now we represent this cost of equity as KE. So KE is basically representing cost of equity. So whenever someone says calculate KE, so this means this is cost of equity. Now we have two methods to calculate KE. Method number one, as you can see, is known as dividend valuation model. We can call this as DVM. And the second method is known as capital asset pricing model. So through DVM and CAPM, we can work out the cost of equity. So let's start with the first one, that is known as dividend valuation model. In DVM, that is dividend valuation model, we need to cover two things. The first is the calculation of DVM, and second, the drawbacks, disadvantages of DVM. So let's first start with the calculations of DVM. The calculation of DVM includes two things. So I can say you can work out KE using DVM in two different situations. One is known as constant dividend situation. So you can see the formula in front of you. The formula is KE is equals to D divided by P naught. So this is the first situation through which we can work out KE, but the situation is known as constant dividend situation. So friends, let's understand what D and P naught means, and this is important to understand. Starting from the first one, we all know that KE is cost of equity D. Now D represents what? So D means dividend in 1 year time. This means the dividend that the company will pay in 1 year time is known as D. So D represents dividend in 1 year time. What is P naught? So you can see P naught here. So P naught represents current share price, X dividend. So we'll discuss what actually X dividend means, and we can also say this as year 0 share price. So P naught represents a share price that one can say is in year 0, and year 0 means current share price. So one thing that is important to remember is X dividend, the condition of X dividend that I will explain you later on. that what X dividend means. So this is the formula, and it's a simple formula. Constant dividend means what? Constant dividend means that the company will pay same amount of dividend every year. Because the method is dividend valuation model, so the method uses dividends. And as I mentioned, the first assumption of constant dividend means that the company will continue to pay same amount of dividend every year. So if the company intends to pay same amount of dividend every year, then we have to use this first method to calculate cost of equity, which is cost for the company and return for the shareholder. So now let's illustrate how we will work out the KE in case of constant dividend. Okay, question 1. Company paid a dividend of 30 cents for many years. You can see here it says many years. Now this means that the policy is of constant dividend, because it is clearly mentioning here many years. So if it says many years, so it's clear that the policy is of constant dividend and every year the company will pay the same amount of dividend. The current share price is 1.5x dividend. Calculate the cost of equity. So the share price that is given to us is X dividend, and this is what we saw in the formula. Still we haven't discussed what X dividend actually means, but it should be X dividend, so this is the case. Now let's work out the cost of equity, because it's a constant dividend situation and the company paid a dividend of 30 cents. So this is clear that dividend has been paid. So the company has paid the dividend for current year. Now KE is equals to D divided by P naught. So P naught is 1.5. KE will be worked out if we have dividend. So we do have dividend, but you need to understand this, that the dividend that you can see here represents the dividend for the current year. As the word itself suggests, that company paid a dividend of 30 cents. But if you remember, in our formula, the dividend that we require, so as you can see, we need a dividend in 1 year's time. And in our illustration, the dividend that we have is a one which represents the dividend for the current year. So what is the thought behind that? The thought is of constant dividend. The assumption is of constant dividend. That is, the dividend that you have paid in the current year will be same dividend for the next year as well. Will be the same dividend for year 1. So after 1 year, the company will continue to pay the same dividend. So this is the assumption. The dividend that you have paid now will remain same in 1 year's time as well. And this was indicated by the question by mentioning that company pays 30 cents dividend for many years. So this is how it is represented. Now we know that we need to use constant dividend formula, and the current year dividend will be used